Hello and welcome back for another Torah Tuesday. I'm Dr. Carmen Imes. Today we are diving into a passage that has been hotly contested. This is a passage that often comes up in debates over abortion rights, and so we're going to take it slowly and carefully. I'll begin by reading from my translation of the Hebrew. First, just a framing comment. This passage continues the question of liability for injury or death. So if you haven't watched the previous 3 videos in this series, you'll want to back up and do that so that you can see the logic that's unfolding in the covenant scroll of Exodus. All right, so beginning in Exodus 21, verse 22. If men are struggling and they stumble against a pregnant woman, and her children go out prematurely, but there is no harm, he must be fined according to what the husband of the woman sets upon him, and he must give it according to the judicial decision. But if there is harm, then he shall give life for life, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot, a scar for a scar, a bruise for a bruise, a wound for a wound. This last part of the verse is known as the lex talionis, the eye for an eye passage, and people sometimes imagine that this is the Bible encouraging retribution or encouraging vengeance, but actually it limits vengeance. It limits the punishment to whatever the harm was that occurred. So if you injure someone's eye, you don't have the death penalty for that. If you injure someone's eye, then the worst thing that could happen to you is your eye would be plucked out in order to have an appropriate punishment for what you have done. So the point of the lex talionis is not to encourage vengeance, but to limit it. Now, this passage is exploring the question of what if 2 men are fighting. Now, in the last passage, previous week's video, we talked about if 2 men are fighting and one of them is injured, then the one who did the injuring is responsible to pay loss of wages and medical care. So this is continuing that same logic. What if 2 men are fighting and the person who's injured is not one of them, but is an innocent bystander? And the nature of biblical case law is often that an extreme case is put forward as a way of, it's a hypothetical scenario that allows reflection on a specific and unlikely event, but it has broader implications. It will help with moral reasoning to develop judicial wisdom for complex cases. So in this case, the scenario is quite specific. What if the bystander to this fight who's injured is a woman? What if it's a pregnant woman? What if she's injured so that she's caused to go into premature labor? And what if there's harm to the child? So we have a very extreme scenario. This would have been almost unthinkable, probably rare, but it's helping us think about what is the value of a woman? What is the value of a child? What is the value of a child before they're even born? So it's taking the most extreme examples of vulnerable humanity and using that as the case. So there's a lot of debate in this passage around 2 phrases. When it says, and her children go out, is this talking about live birth or miscarriage? If you assume that she miscarries, then the rest of the passage is describing harm to the woman, not harm to the baby. The baby's already dead. We know this. If this is referring to live birth, so she gives birth prematurely, then the question about harm could pertain to her or the baby. And so that's the second layer of debate around this passage, is the phrase, there is no harm. Is this referring to there is no harm to the woman, there is no harm to her children, or there is no harm to both? So let's explore how this works. It's easy to see why people look to this passage to argue against or for abortion, because depending on how you spin those first 2 answers, you're either not concerned with the loss of a preborn child, or you are concerned about it. So although this passage says nothing about a woman or her partner seeking to end a pregnancy, the passage does have some relevance for this debate, and we'll circle back to that question at the end. Some presume a miscarriage on the basis that in the ancient world, how could a premature birth actually even survive? But actually, we have one story in 1 Samuel 4:19 and 20 of a preterm labor situation in which the mother dies, but the child survives. So it is possible for a preemie to survive. That possibility makes this a great case study to illustrate the most extremely vulnerable form of human who receives injury in case of a fight. So 3 factors suggest to me that the child's death is not presumed, but that the harm described pertains to both mother and child. Let me give you my 3 reasons. First of all, eye for an eye, by definition, focuses on protection for weaker members of society or those of inferior social standing. The eye for an eye is in contrast to what other nations are doing when someone from a higher social class injures someone from a lower social class. They just pay a fine. And the biblical text says no fines for this kind of injury. There needs to be actually commensurate injury or commensurate harm. So if the woman is innocent, as an innocent bystander to this fight that happens, how much more the child? The child who had no choice but to be in close proximity to the fight because he or she came in the womb of his mother. This case is actually only relevant to pregnancy if the child itself is in view. So track with me here. If the woman loses an eye, but there's no harm to the child, then the fact that she was pregnant is irrelevant. By making her pregnant and talking about the child going out from her or the children going out from her, if it's a multiple birth, then it seems to me that by definition, we are talking about the health and safety of the child. Otherwise, why mention that she's pregnant? Number 2, the law specifies and her children go out, which also suggests that their well-being is in view. So this could be preterm labor, or it could refer to eventual birth. So she's maybe struck in a fight. Later, a month later, when she gives birth, they examine the child to see if there was any injury to the child who was at the time in utero. What I find particularly persuasive in this regard is that the verb yatsa, which is the verb for to go out, so her children go out, refers to live birth elsewhere. So Genesis 25, verses 25 and 26 is one example. Genesis 38, 28 to 30 is another example. In fact, the verb yatsa is used 16 times in the Bible for birth, and 15 times it's successful birth, though often in challenging situations, maybe multiple children, so there's twins, or there's some other challenge to the situation. Yatsa is regularly used for live birth, so I don't know why we would assume otherwise here. Propp says in his commentary that the technique in Exodus 21 is to compress multiple legal issues into a small number of complex paradigmatic cases, which is why we get this really complicated. It's not just a bystander, it's a woman. It's not just a woman, it's a pregnant woman. It's not just a pregnant woman, but it's a pregnant woman who then gives birth as a result of being struck. And so now we're wondering, what is the liability for those men who were irresponsibly fighting so close to innocent bystanders? The text also does not use the unambiguous word for miscarriage, which we would expect if that is what is assumed about the birth. So if she miscarries, but there's no harm to her, there's an easy way to say that in Hebrew. That word actually appears in the covenant scroll, chapter 23, verse 26. So it's known in this time period. So it seems to me that it's more to me, this tips the scales in favor of a live birth in which the health and well-being of the children is in view. Number 3, casuistic laws in the ancient Near East deal with extreme or unique cases. As I've mentioned, an unborn child is the most vulnerable version of a child, and this is an accidental death. So normally, someone who causes an accidental death, we talked about this, I think, 2 weeks ago, someone who causes an accidental death is not subject to the death penalty. They're supposed to flee to a city of refuge and cling to the altar, and that absolves them of the blood guilt. In this case, this is an accidental death because the men fighting were not trying to kill this child or this woman, but their carelessness caused it, and therefore it's treated more stringently than if it was just an accidental death of 2 men working in the field or whatever. So this law is also more stringent than previous laws in that it's not focused just on loss of labor. The woman and her child are not income producing members of the Israelite household at this stage as a pregnant woman. And so this is not just concerned with loss of labor, but concerned with the harm to her body and the body of her child or children. So it seems to me that it's good for us to recognize that the lex talionis, the eye for an eye, as I've already said, limits the punishment so that it's no greater than the harm caused. But it also expresses the maximum penalty. We have very little evidence of people actually plucking out each other's eyes or cutting off each other's hand because of this law. This is showing, here's the maximum of what you can do to someone who is guilty of this. So what's the bottom line? Here in this passage, I think what we see, based on the reasons I've given, is the value and personhood of children even before they are born. If you're familiar with my work on the image of God, my book Being God's Image, I argue that the image of God is not dependent on any particular capacity that we have. And if we take that seriously, then the lack of capacity, say intellectual or relational capacity of an unborn child, is no longer a factor to determine personhood. So the value and personhood of children, even pre-birth, is being upheld in this passage. The value of women is being upheld, and that value not being attached to labor, but just inherent in being a living human. So, if accidental harm to a fetus is taken so seriously that there are stiff penalties given to those who accidentally harm a fetus, how much more if that harm is intentional? Have a great week.